going to talk on Tocqueville's wonderful book on democracy, which is, I think, the best book on America and the best book on democracy. Those two things together. The title is, are you understanding me when I go like this? Yes? Okay. The title is Democracy in America. There are books about America and there are books about democracy. When you read this book, you see there are some things which are in accord with democracy as a general government everywhere, and some things are peculiar to America. So he says democracy is in America. So this general form of government, universal, everywhere possible, is in this one country. And sometimes he's going to tell you about the logic or the principles of democracy, and other times he will tell you about what is special to America. For example, America had slavery. That's not essential to democracy. In fact, it's not good. But that was part of America. So when he talks about democracy in America, he tells you about how democracy concerns or acts on slavery. Now, who was Tocqueville? He was a Frenchman, a French aristocrat. He lived from 1805 to 1859. And you could say very quickly that he was a liberal who was at the same time an aristocrat. His name is Alexis de Tocqueville. De in French means from. So the aristocrats were known with a de because they were from a particular area. And Tocqueville, you can now visit. It's still a very small place in Normandy, in France. And there's still his chateau, his castle there, which you could visit. And that was his family. And his father lived through the French Revolution, which was in 1789. And he lived through the terror, so-called terror of the French Revolution, when many aristocrats were arrested and their heads cut off. And that almost happened to him, but he was just saved by the death of Robespierre, who was leading the terror before it happened. But he was so frightened that his hair turned white at the age of 22. Now, Tocqueville, his son, went into politics, and he was elected to an assembly in the Second French Republic, and he actually became a minister of foreign affairs for 5 months in 1851. He was not a successful politician. There is a passage in his souvenirs in which he speaks of looking at his fellow members of the assembly. And he said, I know they are human beings and that they must have faces, each his own and different, but I just can't remember them. So if you're a politician, you have to remember faces. And he was not good at that. He was always in politics, though, and also in philosophy. And you could say, to sum it up, that he was unusually detached from, for a politician, much more philosophic, and at the same time unusually engaged as a philosopher. So he mixed together politics and philosophy. Now I'm going to turn to the introduction to democracy in America. And it has 2 volumes, really. In this, they're just in one, but they're about half of the book is the first volume. And the first volume was published in 1835. So he was born in 1805. So he was 30 years old when he wrote this masterpiece of political analysis. And then he took 5 more years to write volume 2, and that came out in 1840. And the first volume, just to say quickly, is mostly about politics. And the second volume is mostly about what he called civil society. He was, and I know you've been studying this, he was one of the first to invent that expression, something different from politics. The first volume had a great success and immediately sold many, many copies, and it allowed him to become invited and voted to be a member of the French Académie Française, the French Academy of the greatest writers in the country, again at a very young age. The second volume requires a little bit more thought and is less popular, but it's also more interesting, you could say. But the whole thing is interesting. So Tocqueville's book is a book about democracy in America. Maybe that's just a small topic. And America happens to be a large country, not as large as yours, but a large country. And suppose it were democracy in San Marino, a very small country in Italy. Is this better?
Someone couldn't hear you in the back.
Can't hear me in the back? It's okay?
Actually, we cannot hear you very clearly. Sorry.
I'm not speaking very clearly.
No, I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you very clearly.
Okay. Why don't you come up? Come closer.
到前面来，到前面来。我旁边还有同学。没有啊，我 just leave it here.
Okay. So that raises the question, what is America? And the Federalist, which is the other great classic on American politics, and if you read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, you must also read The Federalist, which is a kind of discussion of the American Constitution, also a very old book. And on the first page of The Federalist, it says that America is an experiment for mankind, that previously republics or popular governments had always failed. There were many proposals, theoretical proposals for Republican government, but no republic had ever been a success. The greatest republic that ever was, which was the Roman Republic, turned into an empire. So at the end, it lasted a long time, but at the end, it failed. And there was no example of a modern republic that had succeeded. Maybe Holland, but also Holland fell apart from internal divisions. So Tocqueville says that the progress of democracy is a providential fact. It's a fact which seems to be decreed by God. Why is that? Because, so he provides evidence. For 700 years, he says, the West, Europe, has become more and more democratic. So, and this happens in all the countries of Europe. So it isn't one country, and it isn't one century, and it isn't one person or one people. So and yet it does seem to be a trend which you can understand. So it must be beyond human power, and yet within human understanding. It's not a surprise. So therefore, America is a land of democracy. It is not a backwater. He came to America in 1831 and 32, and he stayed here for 9 months. Came to Boston, came to Harvard even for a couple of days, he and his friend. And this is when they were 25 years old, say 5 or 26 years old, earlier, before he wrote the book. And he said he came to America because he wanted to see not how a country in the wilderness, a backward country, was dealing with European civilization, but how European civilization was going to become in the future. So America was not behind the rest of Europe, it was ahead. And he came to America to see what was in store for Europe. So there are many other Europeans who came to America in the 19th century, and they looked down on America rather condescendingly, and they said that this was a country which is founded by Europeans, but it's still rough and raw and uncivilized and unrefined. So, but Tocqueville just had the opposite impression, and I think he was really alone among the visitors to America from Europe to take this attitude. So American democracy, he says to the Frenchmen and to other Europeans, that's our future. America is the model for Europe. There's a democratic revolution on the way. How should we judge it? Let me read you a little bit from right at the beginning. From his introduction. I don't know how many of you read this. You did. You did or you didn't? So, you've read, some have read. All right. All right. Because I'm hoping that if I say something you disagree with or don't find clear, that you'll raise your hand and tell me. Or if you have another point of view where you want to add something that I forgot to say or that I said wrong, I hope you'll interrupt and say, yeah, wait. All right? So we can have a little discussion. He says, a great democratic revolution is taking place among us. All see it, but all do not judge it in the same manner. Some consider it a new thing, and taking it for an accident, they still hope to be able to stop it. Whereas others judge it irresistible because it seems to them to be the most continuous, the oldest, and the most permanent fact known to history. So there's two ways of judging this new this democratic revolution. You can think that it's an accident, and then you might hope to stop it or check it. And that means you would have a choice. Should you try to stop it or not? Or you can consider it irresistible. It's continuous. It's very ancient. It started 700 years ago. In the year 1100, that would be. And therefore, you can't choose. And Tocqueville doesn't accept either thing, either attitude entirely. He thinks you can choose, but you can't choose everything. You can't choose whether to have democracy or not. The whole world is becoming democratic. He says, when he says democracy is not just a stable or set thing, it always becomes more democratic. And that same thing you could see in America happened after Tocqueville. Slavery was abolished. Now women can vote. Recently, gays can vote. Homosexuals can get married. All the barriers between people seem to be coming down. And each time that one comes down, you say, oh, what's the next? Right? So in America, they had a voting rights bill in 1965, which was to make it easier for blacks to vote. And at the end, there were some Southern senators who didn't like this. And they said, well, if you're going to take blacks and give them all these rights of affirmative action, Maybe you'll also do women, thinking that that was a joke, to carry it to another group previously not treated equally. But then the next thing after the civil rights for blacks came the women's movement. And we've had much more equality for women ever since. So I can see that in my lifetime, and it's close to you too, that democracy is a revolution. It doesn't stay put. It goes and goes and goes. Once you start it, the logic of it makes it hard to stop. So you can't choose whether to have democracy or not, but you can choose to have democratic liberty as opposed to democratic tyranny. And that's one thing to see right off about Tocqueville. When he says democracy, he doesn't necessarily mean that democracy is good, or that democracy means free democracy. There's also a possibility of democratic tyranny. And we're going to see in the first volume this great danger for democracy as the tyranny of the majority. And in the second volume, he talks about the same thing, but in a slightly different guise, and that is what he calls soft or mild despotism, democratic despotism. Democracy has invented a new kind of despotism. And then, we're still in the introduction now, he compares democracy with aristocracy. This is a frequent comparison in this book. And he defines aristocracy very generally as just anything that came before democracy. By democracy, he means modern democracy. Even the ancient republics, like Athens, where Socrates lived, to him, that's still an aristocracy, because it wasn't based on the principle that all men are equal. So this term, aristocracy, is a kind of catch-all term for everything that is not modern democracy. Aristocracy stands for the past. So it's not a live choice. You can't choose aristocracy today, in his day, but also not today either, maybe. You can't bring it back, but you can call it to mind. You can think about it. So this is the importance of Tocqueville's time and his aristocratic family, because when he was born, it was just when Europe was moving from aristocracy to democracy. So he saw both sides of that, and he can report to us more clearly what the difference is. But somehow still for us it's interesting, because it helps us better to understand democracy if we know what it was contrasted to, what it came from, what it came out against. And he makes a surprising remark. In aristocracy, there were nobles and there were serfs, landowners and then serfs, peasants who tilled the ground. But there was not the hostility between these two classes, which you might expect. The serfs expected to be serfs. They didn't expect ever to be anything better, to be able to climb out of serfdom. They thought there was a kind of immutable order of nature. This was a delusion of theirs, but still it kept them from hostile feelings towards the nobles. The nobles were sort of shepherds. They had their trust from Providence, from God. So they were entrusted with these serfs. It was their job to take care of them. That also was a delusion. But somehow on the basis of these delusions, goodwill, or at least good relations, was the result. Legitimate privileges. True, these were privileges, but still they were held to be legitimate. That was how things used to be. But now, he says, we live in democracy. Everyone considers himself equal. If you consider yourself equal, you look around, and anyone you see, is no better than I am. So why should I obey that other person? So immediately, there's a question of legitimacy in democracy, which you don't find in aristocracy. Why do we need to have government? And if it's government, we need to have it, why should it be these people and not me? And don't I know, as much as they do, I'm equal? And they're no better than equal. So Tocqueville says, this is degrading to the soul. The exercise of power that is considered illegitimate. If you say your parents, you respect them, and they tell you to do something, you do it, and you don't feel bad or feel degraded. But if you're equal to everybody, and somebody orders you to do something, then you do. Why should I do it? And they feel that obedience to power has been usurped. Those people have no right to govern. So, and yet I still obey. And so that makes me feel degraded. I'm hurting myself. I'm selling myself short. I'm doing an injustice to myself. And so when you do that, your soul is degraded. And here then is a liberal, Tocqueville, who talks about souls. It isn't just the preceding liberals talked about bodies. And the main point of liberty was, is your body free? Can you move your elbows? There's room here. You won't be hitting somebody every time. But Tocqueville speaks of souls. And still today, I think it's very interesting, social scientists don't speak of souls. They speak of self. And what is a self? Is that just something that comes out of your body? Or is it something that directs your body, has the power to choose for yourself? What is the power of the mind? Can it govern itself? Democracy is about self-government. Doesn't that mean that there must be a soul with a mind that can govern itself? And that we are not just playthings of forces found out for us by social scientists. So that, I think, is the main problem that is raised in this introduction. Democracy and the degraded souls. And the degraded souls are mainly in Europe, because Europe has no legitimate democracy. In Europe, democracy is still debated. It's not accepted. And there are many nobles or aristocrats like Tocqueville who wanted to go back before the revolution and don't accept the coming of democracy that came from resulted from the French Revolution in 1789. So there was a restoration of the monarchy, and there were many nobles who took that part. And then so this first restoration failed, and they got another king, and this king was allowed an assembly. He was a kind of constitutional king. His name was Louis Philippe, and that also failed. And in 1848, the French got rid of the monarchy altogether and instituted a republic, the Second Republic, the first one having been the Revolution. So, can you have democracy without degraded souls? And it raises this very deep philosophical question about choice. Freedom seems to require choice, but you can't choose everything. You can't choose, in certain historical periods, you can't choose to be something totally different. This is a period of democracy. So any government that's going to be viable is going to somehow have to be democratic. And so how does democracy justify itself? And to answer that question, Tocqueville does not go like a political theorist to arguments. This is what is in human nature. We have souls. He just assumes you have a soul. He doesn't say why, or he doesn't give you the arguments why you don't. You know, why it is that you can't choose everything. You can't choose not to die. So in a way, does that make you a slave? So what is the basis for freedom or for choice? And I think that's, as I said, what he's talking about right at the beginning of the book. So now let me stop and see how this sits with you. Yeah.
So you mentioned aristocracy is defined by epoch rather than the attribute of this system. And you mentioned that democracy is defined as a society holding the principle that all men are equal.
Yeah.
But at that time, as we all know, America is not an equal society, even there are different races, different classes.
There was what? I'm sorry.
It's not an equal society with the racism, sexism still existing. So how did people decide that it's a democracy in the U.S.?
You could say that, to speak to your first remark, aristocracy, you could define it as a society where the principle is inequality, that some people are better than others. And they too would admit perhaps that some of us are equal, or all of us are equal in some respects. So that we're all going to die, for example. but still, in the most important respects, we are not equal. And so democracy would deny that. And yes, democracy starts off with the statement that all people, all human beings are equal, but that doesn't immediately establish democracy. So in the West, the first person to argue that all human beings are equal was, say, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher of the 17th century. But he immediately set up a system for monarchy. And he made remarks which showed that he didn't really believe that people were equal in every respect, but it's just in the most important respect. And that most important respect didn't always become politically effective or socially effective. So America was the first country, really, to put democracy into practice. And even, as you say, in America, there were lots of ways in which people were unequal, which are obvious to us today, but were thought to be quite reasonable in those days, like men and women were done. Well, Tocqueville's going to talk about women, so we can get that later. But and then he's also going to talk about the races and how they are treated very unequally. The main point about the races is that the whites thought that all men are created equal, but that the blacks and the reds, the Indians, were not really men or human beings. They were subhuman. They were inferior types of human being, and so didn't deserve to be treated equally. That was especially the way it was argued in the South. But in the North, there were a lot who didn't like slavery, thought it was wrong, but they weren't willing to fight to abolish it. So they tolerated it, hoping that it would go away. So that's how, so when I say that democracy in practice, I don't mean that everything was perfect. Now that's why democracy is a democratic revolution. Keeps getting on more because people look around and they say, this is inconsistent. This isn't, our principle says equality, and yet we're not practicing it. And then other people resist, and they say, the conservatives, you could say, they say, oh, there's good reason for not. For example, children are less mature than adults. But in America, children are the kings, as you know.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Okay. Okay, let's move. Is this any more questions? Yes.
You raised a question at the end.
What is the question at the end?
What's the basis of democracy?
The basis of democracy. That all the inequalities which you see are merely privileges that have come from powerful groups or rulers. And if you look at the nature of people, then you see that we're, each one of us, equal to the others. Even though there are differences in ability, in intellect, and talent, and so on, the most important thing about us is, well, that's a good question. Tocqueville's going to say the most important thing is courage and the ability to stand up for your rights. So it's almost a matter of will. If you think you are equal, that makes you can make yourself equal. If everybody agrees with you. Yeah.
So you put the base of democracy to human nature. But I have to ask how much you believe that this idea comes from Christian beliefs.
How much? I'm sorry.
How much of the base of the democracy came from the Christian belief?
Oh yes. Tocqueville says a good deal. He says that Christianity did not invent the idea of equality, but it made it powerful or universal, because people have equal souls. So it doesn't seem he thinks that's the basis of the argument in favor of democracy, but it helped propagate that belief that people are equal. So, but again, he's talking more about facts and less about theories with arguments.
So you talk about the basis, the foundation of the freedom is choice. But do you think a man should have the choice to give up his freedom?
That's right. So choice, people exercise their choice to give up their freedom, as happened under aristocracy. They didn't even know they had a choice. So that's what he's worried about. That he's worried that democracy will give itself over to the taste for material enjoyments, little pleasures of the body, and in return for satisfying those little pleasures, getting those little pleasures, you will give up your freedom.
So I think to go deep into the meaning of freedom, is there any relationship with freedom and originality? So that I mean, to say I am a free man does not mean I can choose to give up or gain all the things, but I have the rationality to do the correct choice. So
Yes, that's what he says. This is a dogma, he says. The dogma of democracy is that each individual has enough reason to run his own life. That's what we all believe. There might be somebody else who's wiser, but I can run my life better than any of you can. That's what's believed. So, and you can wonder whether that's totally rational. If somebody else is wiser than you, why can't he run your life better than you can?